Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Before we get started, we're just going to share how to access live French interpretation for anyone who needs it. Tom Haney, our French language support coordinator with the Reforest Canada Collective, is here to explain how to enable those settings. We have Damien and Marina here interpreting for us today. Thanks for being here to translate live into French for us during this session.
Oui, en effet, bonjour tout le monde. Le collectif est très content d'offrir aux participants la possibilité d'écouter le webinaire en français. Par défaut, vous entendrez la voix du conférencier en anglais en même temps que l'interprète, mais à un volume plus faible en arrière-plan. On peut également désactiver complètement l'audio original en cliquant sur Couper l'audio original qui se trouve en bas de cette fenêtre. Et avec cette option, vous n'entendrez que la voix de l'interprète. Et bon, c'est tout pour moi. Bon webinaire.
Okay, actually, we'll leave this screen on here for a minute to allow you some time to access the settings if you like. So I'm Amber. I'm the Tree Planting Resource Manager with the Reforest Canada Collective, or RCC, we're calling for short. And I will be hosting today on camera. Sarah Barker, our project manager with the RCC, can also be found in the chat in a little bit and is there to help you with anything you need during this session. Please note that this session is being recorded. We will post the link on our website soon in the Knowledge Hub. As mentioned, this webinar series is being held by the Reforest Canada Collective. This is a 2 billion tree funded initiative launched in December of 2024. The RCC exists to support the implementation of 2 billion tree projects around the country, and we do this by creating a platform for Canada's tree planting community to connect, collaborate, and share knowledge. The webinar series is one of our first offerings, as many 2 billion tree projects are being implemented on post-wildfire sites. As a community-driven initiative, we invite you to visit our website to learn more and reach out to discuss any ideas on how the RCC can help your organization. We will hear from 3 speakers today, and we will open the floor up to questions at the end. Please use the Q&A box to type in any questions you have for the speakers. We welcome participation in the chat as well, so feel free to introduce yourself now and let us know where you're calling in from, including the traditional territory if you like. The organizing team and speakers are joining this session today from the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, Kanien'kehá:ka, Mississauga, Anishinaabeg, Algonquin, Huron-Wendat, Treaty 7 territory, Mi'kmaq, and Beothuk. We recognize the essential role that fire has played in the traditions and practices of many Indigenous peoples in what we now call Canada, and that we hope to give a platform to discussions that advance the integration of the role that cultural burning can play in landscape restoration as well. This series will highlight Canadian research on forest dynamics in a changing climate and provide a few examples of different approaches for tree planting after wildfire. The approaches and strategies presented today are being trialed in specific ecological contexts. The intention is not to advocate that these approaches be duplicated in other sites across the country, but rather to share ideas, options, and insights about what might be working and what is working and what may not be working. To help everyone do just that, we'll be compiling notes, learnings, and takeaways from each session of this series to summarize the knowledge shared. I'm happy to introduce Val today, Val Desiel, Director of our Restoration Programs at Forest Canada. She's going to be our moderator today. Val is a grasslands and woodland management expert. She has a wealth of knowledge in the use of prescribed fire as a tool for landscape restoration, and she's an RX 200 burn boss with over a decade of experience in this practice. Thanks for moderating today's session, Val. Would you kick us off?
Thank you, Amber. I'm happy to be moderating today's session. Before we start talking about restoring forests after wildfire, I would like to begin by recognizing the devastating impacts that these recent fires have had on many communities across Canada and most recently in the US. Well, the conversation we're going to have today center on some of the more technical aspects of ecological restoration. We can't forget that people are often important parts of these ecosystems as well. And there are groups such as Fire Smart Canada and the Public Health Agency of Canada that are doing outstanding work on the human safety and prevention aspects of wildfire. We want to emphasize that above all else, human safety and future fire risk prevention are paramount when talking about wildfire recovery. By thinking about how we plant trees after wildfire, the hope is that we can establish healthy forests that are resilient to future fire risk, regardless of whether they're close to communities. Many studies are showing that it is undeniable that the patterns of wildfire frequency and severity have been changing across the entire country. We are seeing fires spread at unprecedented rates, and we have also seen fires sweep through ecosystems that are historically not adapted to fire. For example, the 2023 Canadian wildfire season saw a record-breaking 15 million hectares burn, which is 7 times the historical national average. For this reason, this is uncharted territory for all land managers, and we are all learning together. Making the decision of whether to restore a site is as important as writing the planting prescription itself. So it's critical to consider each site on a case-by-case basis, and that we identify the long-term goals for a project before getting started. This series is all about sharing research on forest dynamics and a few examples of different approaches being used for tree planting after wildfire. This is only the beginning. We recognize that more research and experimentation is needed to fully understand the best practices for this type of restoration in Canada. We want to recognize that post-wildfire recovery is a developing field with few established experts, making peer learning and collaboration with researchers and knowledge holders essential for implementing this important work effectively. The focus of today's session, species shifts, is just one aspect that contributes to the complexity of decisions that need to be made before planting after wildfire. As fires become increasingly frequent and intense, natural regeneration success for certain species has become more variable, and in the past due to soil burning to the mineral level, sites being colonized by invasive species, and finally, ecosystems that aren't fire adapted are burning, leading to slow, if any, forest recovery. With the aim of working towards establishing healthy forests for a future, we need to adapt our tree planting approach in terms of species selection, and that's exactly what we're talking about today. Species selection considerations when tree planting after wildfire. I'd like to thank our speakers today for offering their time for this webinar session. First up is Dr. Lucas Brehaut, who is a wildfire research scientist with the Canadian Forest Service in Corner Brook, Newfoundland. He completed his PhD in geography at Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador. While much of his current research is focused on the ecology of post-fire landscapes and the impact that continued climate warming will have on regenerating forests, he has become involved with national research examining fire risk and community preparedness, as well as highlighting underserved actors in wildfire monitoring. Welcome, Lucas.
Thank you so much. All right, folks.
So you can share your screen now if you like.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Thanks so much, everyone, for inviting me to talk today. I have the very special privilege of, I guess, kind of kicking off a little bit of this, but interesting talking about the ecology of fire and how it's changing, the role of fire in ecosystems, as well as the ecological consequences of those changes, all within about 10 minutes. So buckle up, folks. We're going to have a great time here. And it's probably going to be more like 12 minutes. Let's be honest. So talking about fire, oftentimes we are start off presentations with some pretty devastating photos. But I'd like to kind of switch it a little bit and talk about fire first in a positive light. Fire is a natural disturbance that occurs on the landscape and is almost required for many forested ecosystems around the world. And many species within the forests have evolved reproductive strategies to take advantage of fire on the landscape. So we've got black spruce, for example, which has aerial seed banks. If we see in the top right-hand corner there, those aerial seed banks that release their seeds onto the ground after a fire goes through. Similarly, light wind-dispersed seeds of fireweed are able to take advantage of these novel ecosystems after they've burnt. Ponderosa pine has very thick bark, evolved to have thick bark to survive these low severity fires that come through. And we can actually see this, the evidence of this through fire scars. It's also important to acknowledge the fact that humans have kind of been co-creators of this relationship between plants and fire for centuries. We have this image here from the University of Wisconsin, which shows fire scars in pine species at a very high frequency. And this is indicating that, individuals, First Nations peoples, Indigenous peoples, have been on the landscape kind of maintaining that fire regime at a very short interval to promote the health and wellness of forests. So although the fact, of course, fire is a natural disturbance and it's important when it occurs near the built population. That's when it's often tragic. It's very challenging to deal with and incredibly costly. And under climate change, this continued relationship, tragic relationship, is going to increase within the built environment. And so 2023 was a banner year, as we are all very well of, and which Val indicated at the very beginning. And I just put these news stories up here to showcase that it was truly a national issue. It wasn't regionally specific. Fires occurred on the island of Newfoundland all the way across the country. So this is something that we really need to come to terms with. Now, we've seen that 2023 was the banner year, but the trend of a more area burned is actually increasing, right, over the last 30 to 40 years. And we can see that in 2024 actually was a pretty high year in terms of area burned. The area burned across the country. So what is causing this increase in area burned across the country? Well, it's not a simple story. There's regional characteristics that are involved. There's interannual variability, but we can kind of summarize it into three different components. The first one being fuel characteristics and legacies. So this is a black spruce forest in Newfoundland. If we're thinking about the characteristics, we're thinking about, what's actually there in the understory? What does the overstory look like? Is it deciduous or is it coniferous? Is it very flammable? Is it not? Is there a lot of dead wood, etc.? Also, the legacies of management. Was there Indigenous cultural burning on these landscapes? Was it a let it burn policy that has happened over decades? Or was there a no fire on the landscape for various reasons? The second component is weather, which is, seasonally variable. Drought conditions. I absolutely love this figure here, which shows the precipitation ranking since 1940 from March to May of 2023. And what we can see here is in the Atlantic provinces, or the Maritimes specifically, it was the second driest to driest since 1940. And what happened in 2023 at the end of May? We had those record breaker wildfires in Nova Scotia. So somewhat of a clearer link in this location. And finally, we have our ignition events, right? In order for a fire to happen, we also need an ignition, whether that's natural or human caused stories. And under climate change, all three of these situations or characteristics are changing. And again, regional specific, interannual variability, something that happens in the spring does not indicate what might happen later on in the summer. But it does provide us with a lot of data and evidence to make some predictions. So now that we know what causes fire, let's look at a species that is very close to my heart, but is also one that we're all quite familiar with. This is black spruce. We can see its range from the island of Newfoundland all the way to interior Alaska, coastal Alaska, really. Black spruce is a fire-adapted species. It's got serotinous cones. It's got those aerial seed banks that we've talked about. And when a fire comes through, perfect. This is what we might expect to see a couple years after fire, where we've got, standing dead, fireweed growing, and then, some seedlings would start to pop up, and eventually 80 to 100 years later, we get something like this again. But under a changing fire regime, we've got fires that are too hot, or the severity is much higher. And I think we're getting into that in the next session, which is interesting. Fires are becoming too frequent. So rather than happening every 80 to 100 years, they're happening every 30 to 40 years, or you know, what have you. And finally, fires are happening in areas where they're historically uncommon. So I've done a lot of research up in northern Yukon, in Ventot and Trondheim territories, where we've actually seen wildfires kind of go across the tree line ecotone. Similarly, in Nova Scotia and the Acadian forests, more deciduous species, we're seeing fires happening there. So how does that translate to changes to the forests? Well, it's these novel fire regimes are changing safe seed beds. And what I mean by that is, you know, if a seed lands on the ground, if all of the organic layers completely combusted, we might have a hydrophobic environment that's exposing those seeds to extreme conditions. If we have really frequent fires, we're going to be changing the reproductive potential. So the actual burning of those newly minted seedlings that have just become reproductive, right? So we've lost that reproductive potential. Moreover, if it's a very high severity fire, we might completely combust the aerial seed banks. And finally, increasing interspecific competition, where, you know, especially at these range edges, we might have species actually that are more adapted to a different disturbance regime actually be able to move in and take hold. And so what we might actually expect, and what has been the case, is we see a transition from a forested ecosystem to a shrubland or a grassland ecosystem. And this photo was taken by Dr. Carissa Brown in northern Yukon of an area that experienced high frequency fires. We can see this is happening across Canada. Balzer et al. In 2001 published a review paper looking at black spruce resilience specifically. And we can see in the kind of red and yellow, there is a high degree across the country of regeneration failure, competition, and poor establishment. And this figure on the right looks at the trajectory of change. So when black spruce is being lost, what is it turning into? Something different, right? Okay, so all of that being said, I've got about 2 to 3 minutes left. I'm going to just briefly showcase a little bit of my research that I'm doing. So in 2022, the year before 2023, the island of Newfoundland actually had their record-breaking wildfires, 3 of them in central Newfoundland. And so I thought this was an excellent opportunity to kind of look at wildfires in a cool, wet maritime climate, but also simulate the effects of climate change. So I created a manipulative seed and seedling experiment across central Newfoundland, where seeds were distributed on the landscape and seedlings were planted into the post-burn forests. My study species were black spruce, eastern larch, and red pine. And I use these open top chambers, which carrying this plastic through the woods, I do not recommend it. It's very heavy. But essentially, it warms the surface air conditions by roughly 1 to 3 degrees. So something what we might expect in a climate change environment. So very rapidly get into some results of some black spruce seedling data. June 2023 was when the project was initiated. We can see the seedling height here between the control and the OTCs, which is that warmed environment. And we look at that mean line. That's what I want you to look at. April 2024, so a growing season and a winter later, little bit of a difference in the mean height, but not significant. What's interesting now, though, is a full 2 growing seasons later, in July 2024 and November of 2024, we can see a significant difference in the height of black spruce seedlings in a warmed environment that has burned compared to just in burned environment.
Lucas, we're at 1 minute. 1 minute.
Perfect. So planted seedlings 2 years post-fire, we see an increase in height, but there's no difference in basal diameter. So that's for me to figure out later. Just quickly looking at the number of seeds germinated, a little bit of a different story, but what I want you to focus on is the control. This is an area that has not a lot of natural seed germination or seed distribution. So this is an indication of potential need for forest management. In areas where we know that forest resilience might be required, we might need to move in with our seed planting. So with that, I just want to thank you and leave you with some photos of some lovely visitors, some of them a little bit more destructive than others. But yes, if there's any time for questions in the future, I'd be glad to take them. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucas. Excellent presentation. Next, we have Brant Broome. Brant is a head forester at Shakti by Telus, drawing on 21 years of land management experience. Brant has been a cornerstone of this company since 2023. His visionary leadership sets forest industry standards, and he has built key partnerships with Indigenous peoples, government, and industry. Brant's strategic insight drive innovative environmental initiatives. His commitment to safety and stewardship and passion for collaborative dialogue shape better outcomes for all. Welcome, Brant.
Thanks. I'll just share my screen here. Okay, can you see that?
Yes, great.
Okay, thanks. So today I'll be presenting on tree species selection for planting and wildfire restoration. Before that, I just want to acknowledge that I am honored to reside and work on Treaty 7 territory, traditional lands of the Stoney Nakoda peoples of the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley bands, the Tsuut'ina, the Niitsitapi, Blackfoot peoples, the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai bands. And I also respectfully acknowledge that we are on the homelands of the Métis Nation within Region 3, and I value this friendship and connection with all nations of the land. Special thanks to the Reforest Canada Collective for putting this webinar series together, the FMA holders and provincial government of Alberta for helping connect all the dots, the Alberta Association of Forest Management Professionals for keeping all the foresters and forest techs aligned with the policies and also promoting this webinar series, and of course Telus, who has been instrumental in making these projects happen. A bit of background on myself. I grew up on a farm with a portable sawmill, so I've been exposed to forestry since I was 5 years old. Started as a tree planter in 2004, making about $25 a day until I got the rhythm down. And then I've been registered with the AAFMP since 2017. And my hobby is the same as my job. So if I wasn't going out and studying trees and watching trees grow as a job, I would be doing it anyways. A bit about Telus. Environmental solutions. So we're a passionate team dedicated to restoring the natural world. We do nature-based solutions that address many societal and environmental challenges such as climate change, food and water security, and biodiversity loss. Restoring nature also supports sustainable livelihoods and local economies. Our focus has been on post-wildfire reforestation as project developers, coastal restoration of mangroves and kelp planting to improve water quality on the coast, and of course, Indigenous partnerships to help communities connect and use and focus on their restoration priorities. A bit about wildfire planting. So our projects are focused on restoring boreal forests destroyed by wildfires. These locations are critical for trumpeter swans, woodland caribou, grizzly bears, and many other sensitive species of wildlife. Without planting, the natural cycle in a place like this could take up to 200 years. So we're just getting trees back on the land a little earlier. Planting considerations. So it's traditional straight planting, but after a fire, especially if quite a few years has passed since the fire, it can feel like extreme field planting at times. Some of the low-lying areas are prone to saturation and flooding, such as the Slave Lake area, and that's partly due to the lack of mature trees since they all burnt up, absorbing in water on the surrounding landscape and hillsides. Scraping is required at times, and that can result in water-filled holes. I'll get a bit more into that on the safety section. And extended frost retention due to grass coverage. So in heavy grass mats, that frost can hang on for an additional week to 2 weeks. timing and protection. So we try to plant as early in spring as possible and also in the summer. Snow cover is a huge benefit to the seedlings for winter protection. However, not every year has had that snow cover lately, especially in the winter of 2023 and 2024. Therefore, we use natural obstacles when possible in a location like that. Depending on the surrounding vegetation, browsing can be a risk to freshly planted seedlings, because if it's a fresh black burnt over and suddenly there's a bunch of green targets for the ungulates, they really stand out and are vulnerable to that. Soil and ground conditions. So we want to avoid planting directly into ash and try to avoid sites without mineral soil. And we steer clear of blackened charcoal areas due to the extreme heat risk. And of course, with any planting, you're considering what that microsite will look like tomorrow, in a week, in a month, or in 5 years, not just what it looks like right at the present moment. We found the most suitable land for this type of project is the non-obligation crown land. So the authority is the provincial government, and nothing can be done on such a location without operating under an annual operating plan and authorization from the government. Just an example of one of our sites, a site description. So the McKernan wildfire of 2019 and the more recent Grizzly Complex wildfires of 2023, these had a devastating impact on not only the communities, but the boreal forest ecosystem and environment in the area. And our focus has been on white spruce dominant stands that have been very slow to regenerate, if at all. And the picture kind of demonstrates that you get grass, fireweed, some shrubs, and you can see the white spruce were doing quite well until that fire. There's also non-merchantable stands. There was never an opening in a location like that, and therefore there's no mechanism to go and do reforestation of such a site. There is the enhanced reforestation of legacy disturbance program that the government runs that may cover some sites like that. Also, we've done some linear caribou restoration work in non-merchantable stands, such as one like this. Deciduous stands, although this is very rare, we're going to pilot a program where a deciduous stand has burnt up adjacent to a large coniferous wildfire. So the suckering process has already taken place in this location, and then that regeneration has burned up. So of course that's something new that we're working on, and we'll be going through the steps to try to make that happen. Prescriptions. So just like a typical silviculture prescription, we have to go and redo that prescription after a fire to see what has changed on the landscape. Everything from ecosites to soil classification and the type of wildlife that's using those sites. And then kind of the core focus of this presentation is on the actual species selection. So like I mentioned, of course, the first step, you can't do anything without following regulatory compliance, especially the Alberta Forest Genetic Resource Management and Conservation Standards. These are rules under the Timber Management Regulation. Also, we must adhere to the Forest Act, Code of Practice for Watercourse Crossings, Fisheries Act, Species at Risk, and several more. Basically, the message is you can't just go into crown land and start planting. You have to consider all of these things. How are you going to get in? What are the water courses situations? Is there any crossings in place? All of those are factors. And of course, we have to stay within designated seed zones. As far as species, we're bound and to stick to what was originally declared on that site in the first plantation. Use native species, so white spruce, black spruce, lodgepole pine, and like I said, mostly we've been focused on the white spruce since that hasn't been regenerating well. And of course, following the prescription that I previously mentioned. As far as strategy, aside from the species, using larger stocks such as 2+0 or a large stock type like a 412 helps with the grass and herb competition that comes in after the fire. The density that we've been finding that results in a past survey is 2,000 stems per hectare. That's a little higher than a typical prescription, but we also have the environmental factors to deal with. So if we do come across natural regeneration on our prescription, then we would decrease that density. And if we're dealing with heavy competition, we may increase it.
Brant, 1 minute.
Okay, that should be perfect. Last but not least, of course, is safety. So there's no there's no tree or reefer that's worth somebody's health and safety. So safety over productivity, and there's no exceptions to that. Obviously, fires create an abundance of overhead hazards, so every site has to be assessed for safety. There is sharp debris to deal with, so the planters have to be cautious of that and wearing the appropriate PPE. And a big challenge is the active fires. So if we're planting in Slave Lake while there's active wildfires all around us and smoke, it makes operations quite difficult. And we've experienced long delays. Reefers have been held up, planters held up in hotels, things like that. So that's just something to consider. It's not worth the health and safety risk, but we do have to deal with the consequences of active wildfires. Thanks, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Brant. Great presentation. Finally, we have Matt McKernan, who is the founder of Integrity Reforestation Incorporated. Also starting his career as a tree planter at just 19, Matt immersed himself in the field, gaining firsthand experience in the challenges and rewards of large-scale reforestation. Over the past 17 years, Matt has not only planted hundreds of thousands of trees, but he has also taken on a leadership role, training and mentoring thousands of dedicated individuals who have worked in his operations. Managing the planting of over 200 million trees has given Matt an unparalleled understanding of the intricate logistics, environmental considerations, and human effort required to successfully restore ecosystems on a grand scale. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yep, good to go.
Okay, great. Okay, everybody, thanks very much. It's great to be with you. My name is Matt McKernan. I'm the founder and current CEO of Integrity Reforestation. If you want to just jump to the next slide. So we're a large-scale reforestation company specializing in restoring landscapes impacted by wildfires and logging. Last year, we planted about 5.4 million trees. This coming season, we'll be doing about 6.3 million trees, of which about 2 million will be on wildfire impacted areas. Next slide. So I'm here to talk to you a bit about our experience reforesting the wildfire that happened in 2023 on the Agoki Forest. A couple things I'll cover are how the fire burned, our approach to wildfire reforestation, keeping in mind that we're still students of this process, as well as some of what we've learned working on this fire, and some areas that we think could use some future study. Next slide. So here we have the area where the fire started on June 12th, 2023. You can see there was no fire. Next slide. Then a lightning storm came through and started the fire. Next slide. So 2 days later, we can see here 36 hectares started burning. Next slide. 5 days later, that increased by a size of about 10 times, jumping to 377 hectares. Next slide. Then 2 days later, that almost quadrupled in size to 1,929 hectares, with winds pushing the fire northeast. Next slide. This is a picture of the actual fire in the Agoki in 2023 that burned, taken from the M&R fire helicopter. Next slide. And then within a few days later, just under 10,000 hectares burned, and the fire was then put out by a heavy rainstorm. Next slide. So from June 12th to the 27th, the fire burned for about 15 days, engulfing just under 10,000 hectares of land. Next slide. So just going to touch on, excuse me, our approach to wildfire reforestation. Next slide. Keeping in mind that, as I said earlier, we remain adaptive and to our learnings in this process. So just some guiding principles that guide the work we do on wildfire reforestation. We first thoroughly assess post-wildfire to develop the appropriate strategies for project-specific wildfire reforestation, knowing that every project is different. We try to focus intervention where natural recovery is struggling and showing signs of ecological distress. Thirdly, we source the local seed for tree planting to preserve the genetic integrity. we plant native tree species, prioritize wildlife enhancement, integrate ongoing monitoring, and obviously remain adaptive as we learn more. Next slide. So just getting into our approach. So first, we try to gather as much data as we can to really understand the conditions that led up to the fire and that were present during the fire. So in this case, we were able to get some good data from the MNRF, from the Agoki station, which was stationed right nearby where this fire burned. So data like rainfall, wind direction, wind speed, temperature, humidity, and this really just helps us give context and perhaps indicators that can inform the overall approach to reforestation. Next slide. Then we identify, map, and assess areas with the most intense burns. So we analyze post-fire satellite imagery. We take and look at drone aerial photography and video. We compare pre and post fire normalized difference moisture index, NDMI, and also NDVI ratings to give a comprehensive understanding of the fire's impact and to identify priority areas for reforestation. So ultimately, we're trying to classify areas of the burn into high, medium, and low severity areas. Next slide. And then, of course, we get on the ground. We conduct ground surveys to assess the level of natural regeneration. So we're trying to identify signs of natural regeneration, such as sprouting and seedling germination, identify factors limiting natural regeneration, so thick duff layers, changes in soil composition and competition from invasive species. Also evaluate the potential for sustaining recovery based on tree species composition and seed bank viability, as well as moisture availability, which is becoming really seemingly very important. Next slide. And then we amalgamate the data. So we try to determine the areas of priority for intervention and areas to be left for natural regeneration. So we focus our intervention in areas heavily burned where the fire severity was high, where no natural regeneration or very little natural regeneration is showing itself, showing the likelihood of a destroyed seed bank. We also focus our intervention where vegetation has been destroyed and soils are eroding or running off, as well on moisture disturbed areas. So where, for example, sphagnum moss has really dried up or been completely destroyed. Also in riparian areas, areas along streams, rivers, and lakes that have been affected by fire, mostly to strengthen the soils. And then on areas that are vital to animal movement and habitat connectivity. And then we try to really avoid intervention in areas that are showing promising signs of natural recovery. Next slide. So just some of the things that we've learned and observed on this project. Next slide. So previously wet areas need time to recover. These are all, in my opinion, pretty interesting observations, but black spruce swamps with sphagnum moss are particularly vulnerable, we find, after wildfires, as the moss layers, which retain moisture and support the ecosystem, are really drying out. These areas rely on gradual moisture replenishment through rainfall, snow melt, and the regrowth of moss and vegetation. So basically, these areas need time to recover. If we're going in too soon, the mosses haven't recovered and therefore aren't receptive to trees that we'll be planting in them. Next slide. This is obviously a big one for us. Planters need wildfire specific instructions. In some cases you still get good rich soils that, it's not that hard to kick the top duff layer off and get at the soil. But in a lot of cases, the soils have been destroyed or they're eroding or running off, and the planters have to work quite a bit harder to find the mineral soil. So there's definitely mounting frustration in some of those sites, and they just need some more specific instructions and in many cases a higher price point because it takes longer, it takes more work for the planters to get the trees into the proper microsites. Next slide. This is an interesting observation. So previously altered soils we have seen are obviously burning quite a bit hotter, much higher intensity. Previously disturbed soils, such as those treated with mechanical disc drenching, you can see photos here of the fire. This is the fire we're working on. So a lot of these areas were, well, a large chunk of some of these areas were previously mechanically site prepped. Disc drenching exposes organic material, disrupting soil layers and creating conditions where oxygen can penetrate deeper into the soil. So we've just observed that, again, these areas are burning with quite a bit higher intensity.
Matt, 1 minute.
Okay, next slide. Just rip through these last few slides. This was briefly touched on by Brant, but weather and Lucas, I think, but weather obviously determines regeneration and recovery potential. A lot of this has to do with the moisture that's returning to these areas. Next slide. One other interesting observation, take it for what it's worth, but a lot of trees on or near roads seem to be surviving in a lot of these areas. Not exactly sure why. Might be due to compacted soils, reduced fuel loads, or microclimates created by the road structure. Just find that that's an interesting observation to make note of. Next slide. And then this I'll just rip through, but next slide. We think that there could be some future study on the impacts of aquatic life, because as these fires burns, the local lakes, rivers, and streams are all heating up in temperature and changing the oxygen levels of these water streams. So that's obviously going to have a major impact on the aquatic life. Next slide. And then just understanding more about what constitutes an effective fire break, because if we can properly understand this, then maybe we can build this into our post-wildfire reforestation strategies. Next slide. And then this is an area that we are focusing really a lot of attention on this project in particular, because we really want to understand how we can enhance the wildlife of these areas. In this project, this area is a unique area for woodland caribou, and we want to really learn beyond just restoring tree coverage, and we want to understand if there's other things that we can do to enhance the recovery of the local wildlife. Next slide. And just a shout out to our partners on this project. Goki Development is the First Nations led organization that we're doing this project with. They hold the sustainable forest license in this neck of the woods, and then a number of not-for-profit organizations that are supporting this project as well. Next slide. And that's everything. So thanks very much for your time.
Wonderful presentation. Thank you so much, Matt. And thank you to all of our speakers. We will now open up the question and answer session. First up, we have a question from an anonymous attendee to Lucas. What do you anticipate to see in the next 2 to 4 years based on the results of just one growing season?
Very interesting. That's why I kind of hinted at this idea of some of the results that I wasn't able to get to. This idea of, height might be increased in these the growing season in the warmed environments, but the basal diameter is still the same. So I'm curious as to whether or not that's necessarily an indication that these trees are actually going to survive. It could be that they are just trying to outpace or have the ability to outpace some of that understory Kalmia angustifolia that is now encroaching in on these areas, or they could be more susceptible to more drought conditions in these warmed environments. So I don't want to count my chickens before they hatch, but I do have some possible scenarios where even in the warming chambers, there might be some more stressful environmental conditions.
Great, thank you. Another question for you, Lucas. So don't go away. Desvander Kambu would like to know, would you be able to repeat the part about seedling regeneration in control parts, especially the part requiring forest management?
Right. So I'm not sure. Basically, the control plots are still in burned locations. So they're about a meter away, if that, from the warming chambers. And essentially, the results from that is there's still a height component. They're still growing. They're doing fine, but just at a much slower rate, if you will. And in terms of a planting, I think this still bodes well for planting operations in burned forests, especially within my study area of Newfoundland and Labrador, that these seedlings, regardless of being in the warming chambers, are still growing. They're still doing well, but just not as high as in a climate change environment.
Thank you. It's also very complicated. Next is a question from Hilary Lafort. Shout out to Hilary. Hi, Brett. Thanks for this wealth of operational knowledge, she says. Are you and your team doing any site prep, including any danger tree removal or anything else to make your site safer for planting?
Okay, good question. We're not actually doing any site prep ourselves, but we are trying to take advantage of site prep that existed prior to the wildfire. So blocks that have been ripped with a D9 or D8 dozer, for example, on the other side of some swamps. And like Matt said, I also found that those areas burned the soil pretty severely. So the competition hasn't been as severe as it is in non-site prepped areas. You get kind of like a row of shrubs and willows at the base of each rip. But we are planting those types of sites and trying to take advantage of it. In the future, we would consider doing site prep on wildfire restoration sites. However, that puts us into a different category of authorization that's dealing with heavy equipment, access concerns, stream crossings, and ground disturbance, all of those things. So for now, we've avoided adding that layer of complexity to it, but it is something being discussed for the future. As far as danger tree removal, typically what we do if there's a lot of overhead hazards is we change the access to a place that's not as hazardous, or just avoid the area altogether. We haven't actually gone in and have completed danger tree removal at this stage.
Thank you very much. Next question from an anonymous attendee. This one for Matt. What are you hoping to see in terms of survivability and percentage-wise? What would be your approach if this was too low?
That's a good question. So we're always hoping to see over 90%. We did a small pilot project in this neck of the woods in June of 2024. Small amount of trees, 28,000 trees, but we planted jack pine, black spruce, and white spruce just to get a sense for how they're doing. The jack pine performed extremely well. The black spruce over 90% survival. Trees looked great. And but the black spruce was noticeably struggling, and I think it was, if I remember correctly, around 60% survival. So that's obviously low. When we have a low rate of survivability there, we will fill plant the areas the following year. But yeah, ultimately we want to make sure that the trees are growing. So with the black spruce, it was probably a combination of improper planting techniques, mostly because it was tough to find the mineral soil in these sites. And also, planters, when they see sphagnum moss, are used to planting a tree right, in the sphagnum moss. Usually it's full of mineral soil, but a lot of areas of sphagnum moss were just completely dried out. So it was a combination of site conditions, microsite selection, and planting techniques that I think contributed to the low survivability on those black spruce trees. But it's definitely something that we'll be monitoring moving forward.
Thank you, Matt. This next question comes from James Farrell, and it's for Lucas. Have you quantified the effects of competition on seedling response? Vegetation management could play a role here, as well as the mitigation of climate change.
Yeah, that's a great question. So specifically in Newfoundland, there's a historical context of Kalmia angustifolia basically overtaking any burn that happens. So for example, in Terra Nova National Park, there's been a fire management team kind of really tasked with understanding how black spruce, old growth black spruce stands, or mature black black spruce stands, when disturbed, are shifting to an open canopy, shrub-dominated landscape. And so that is one of the things I'm going to be getting into, is we're tracking the return of these understory shrub species over time, seeing what impact they might be having on, or the importance that they might be having on seedlings. But it's still, a little too early to tell at this point in the game, just with their direct impact on seedlings.
Thank you very much, Lucas. The next question is from Jim Hunt, directed at Brant. Why plant aspen in burned deciduous areas? Is there some reason that you don't expect natural suckering?
Thanks. That's a good question. One of the FMAs actually identified some sites where it appears that, like I was describing, an aspen stand that had regenerated naturally through the suckering process was adjacent to a large fuel source of coniferous trees and burnt up after the suckering took place. So at this stage, it's kind of a pilot. We just want to see what's happening. But in this particular site, the aspen don't appear to be regenerating a second time. So they just coincidentally got burned off after suckering. And the FMA and ourselves want to do a pilot if all the stars align, and try to plant it and see how that does in comparison to leaving it for natural. It's kind of a small scale idea right now, but there is a couple of those types of stands, and typically that doesn't happen. Like in most of our planting, aspen or poplar wouldn't be considered because they come back naturally just fine, and we just focus on the coniferous species.
Great, thank you. Next question again for you, Brant. An anonymous attendee asked, it was interesting to hear about advanced training required to effectively plant. Was that done on site?
Yeah, we do training typically on orientation. So all the crew members go through an orientation and learn about the microsites. I can't remember exactly what my comment was, if I was talking about safety or the prescription, but for both areas, all of that's covered with training on site.
Great, thank you. We have a question open to the panelists, not directly at anyone, from Tasso Bozic. Have you considered in some coniferous sites where soil is much degraded to put more aspen poplars, which is more adaptable to harsher soil sites? I guess Matt or Brant, if you'd like to answer that one.
From the Alberta perspective, typically not. We tried to plant what was declared previously. So if it was declared as a white spruce stand previously, that's what we would focus on, other than this one rare example that I gave with the aspen.
Great, thank you. This next question is for Matt. From Hillary. For your GIS exercises to prioritize planting areas where the fire severity was high and NDVI changes are noticeable, are you using free remotely sensed imagery? I'm curious to learn more about the tools to get to this analysis. Thanks.
Yeah, we are. I'm not the GIS expert, but we are using free remote sense technology, looking at the NDMI and NDVI. So it helps us pinpoint zones where like moisture depletion is a limiting factor, and also identifies areas where vegetation recovery is naturally occurring versus those areas requiring intervention. So by comparing the pre and post wildfire values, these indices give us a clearer picture of fire severity and the overall ecological impact, and can help inform areas to prioritize for reforestation operations.
Great. I think we have time for one more question from Leona Anton. Are land managers connecting with Indigenous people locally on what objectives they want to see on the land base? Perhaps restore ecosystems that support medicine and food sustenance. Matt or Grant or Lucas, any insight there?
I mean, I can quickly jump in. I know that I'm am involved in a couple of projects where communities are kind of reaching out about kind of the risk side of it, and in terms of fire breaks, understanding what use, if a fire break is going to be put in around a community, what potential uses can those fire breaks become afterwards. And so is this an opportunity for, culturally significant walking trails or harvesting locations, all of that kind of stuff. So.
Okay, great. Amber, are we finished with our question and answer? Shall I move on to the conclusion?
Yeah, let's move on. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. I'll just conclude today's session with a few final remarks and some information on upcoming events, opportunities to keep learning that might be of interest. As we heard from each of our speakers today, when we think about restoring landscapes after fire in the future, we need to take into consideration these shifts in species composition that we're seeing across the landscape. Whether it be through assisted migration or investing in seed collection for growing climate adapted trees, there's a lot more work to be done in this field of landscape restoration. Safety should always be a top priority in wildfire ecosystem recovery, and it's good to see that significant effort is placed on occupational health and safety when planting trees after wildfire. An important consideration is respiratory health and smoke exposure that planters face while planting. We should all be sure to include those risks as well when designing and restoration plan. When it comes to wildfire recovery, we will never have a one-size-fits-all approach for tree planting and restoration. What we do know for certain is that the period after a fire, when the landscape starts to come back to life, this is a critical time when we can make sound decisions about restoring forests through tree planting for maintaining ecological integrity, while also mitigating future fire risk and adapting to our changing climate. It's important for us to have these conversations. Knowing more about who is already doing the work and research in this practice will add to the confidence levels needed to make those critical decisions. So thank you once again to Lucas, Brant, and Matt for being so generous with your time and sharing your experiences today. I'd also like to quickly take the opportunity to share some details about Forest Canada's upcoming conference before handing the mic back over to Amber. Forest Canada is hosting our annual conference in Mississauga, Ontario on February 20th. It will be a jam-packed day of expert speakers and important discussions featuring a variety of topics, including technological advances and support and shape landscape restoration, Indigenous-led strategies for economic and environmental resilience, the transformative power of reforestation work, and so much more. The event will kick off the evening before, February 19th, with an evening social and awards. Register at forestcanada.ca/conference. We hope to see you there. Thank you again.
Okay, I'm just going to jump ahead quick to next week's session. So next week, we'll hear from 3 new speakers on the topic of planting trees after severe wildfires. I hope to see you all back here next Wednesday at the exact same time. The English and French recordings of today's session will be available soon on our Knowledge Hub in the website. So please visit our website, reforestcollective.ca, for the recordings and Knowledge Hub and all the events that we have coming up. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you.